Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to video game news for November 1st, 2024. So we made it through October, me personally barely, it feels like. Yeah, just as I was pretty much finished with remodeling and fixing and repairing a room in my house, a tree decided to drop half of its branches into my neighbor's yard, and so now there is just yet another disaster on top of a medium-sized emergency that's just getting worse and definitely not getting better. It's taking up more of my time. You will notice that if I ever get around to scheduling videos, that the amount of breaks in between recording each episode is going to be bigger. I'm just not likely going to be on the ball, if I ever was on the ball, as much, and very often I'm just getting way more often than I appreciate. I'm getting interrupted by phone calls. Yeah, it's just a nightmare. And inherently, when I started this YouTube channel 10 plus years ago, it feels like it's been over 10 years now, there was it may very well have been less than that slightly, but there was a thought that maybe 3-4 years of hard work would get me at least monetized. And in fairness, when I started, the requirements to be in the YouTube Partner Program were much lower, so I was monetized for a brief moment there to get about $100 worth of ad revenue, but then they moved the goalpost to have to be 10 times as many subscribers, and watch time was now a factor when it wasn't before. But yeah, I'm somewhere around like 950 subscribers, so I could get 50 more subscribers to get over the 1,000 requirement. But I'm also, without having any scheduled videos coming out, my watch time is probably terrible, and there's never been a case where taking prolonged breaks, which is what effectively I'm doing because I'm just too lazy and too busy to actually schedule videos, has ever helped a channel. If anything, all I'm doing is shaking off the 900 loyal subscribers I have, which most of them are not really loyal subscribers, because for my 950 subscribers, videos that were scheduled in the past were getting 4 or 5 views. So it's almost going to be the equivalent of starting all over from scratch at 1,000 subscribers, as far as trying to get watch timers and trying to get viewers that actually would watch my videos in the long plays longer, or just get watch time in general to be longer. And yeah, by not putting up scheduled videos, it's not really helping YouTube Shorts performance, and it's not really helping the live stream performance. But yeah, the hope was 10 years ago, to finish my thought, was that this would be, if not a actual career that would pay actual bills, that it would be at least a bit helpful. Whereas increasingly it looks like what's going to happen is that this medium disaster is just going to be a maximum disaster, and then I may not have time to do anything. I may straight up just be homeless, not living at all, potentially just starving to death somewhere. But yeah, so things are not good, and I'm certainly not feeling particularly positive at the moment, to say the least. Now, I am playing Torchlight 2, and I'm enjoying it greatly. In fact, enough that I am a little concerned that I'm just going to end that game and not really have anything else to play similar. And so there is almost this argument that I would like to just play Diablo 4 and make that comparison, since I'm pretty sure Diablo 4 is the only game on Steam at the moment would be a little bit weird, but not that weird. The weirder part of Diablo 4, we'll just click on Diablo 4 here and go to their store page, though, is just that it's not particularly what people want, because you can see that in the reviews, because it's just not a consistent character. New seasonal content forces your character, I believe, to reset. And I think this Vessel of Hatred DLC in particular is not what people really want. There is another game that is more of the spiritual successor to Diablo 2 and Diablo 3, and I believe it's this Path of Exile, which is a free-to-play game. And where do they even put, if there's any in-app purchases? Over here. So, but that too introduces the seasonal aspect of it. You know, so I could see myself going for that too. This is a fairly old game, though, coming out in 2013, whereas Diablo 4 is a relatively new game. And one of the things while I was playing Torchlight 2 that I recognized is there is just this weirdness around how Diablo-like games with their top-down perspective have been replaced probably by a major part of gamers with games like Destiny, where Destiny and Borderlands, which, yeah, I guess Borderlands, the pre-sequel, would be the next game to really think about playing. They take that same RPG character class concept, they take the loot drop concept, they take the vendor trash concept, they take the leveling up concept, they take unique bosses and potentially unique drops. They take all of that and they just put it in a more modern, more recognizable first-person, third-person shooter style versus the mouse and keyboard gameplay mechanics of Diablo 1 and 2 and Torchlight, which Torchlight 2 and Torchlight 1 I believe did have controller support on the consoles, and just it's one of those few games that weirdly has controller support for consoles but not for the PC version of the game, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, particularly now that Xboxes, at least, and maybe PlayStations, I don't think PlayStations have mouse and keyboard support, but Xboxes technically do, so you can just plug in a mouse and keyboard into an Xbox Series X now and play, I think, pretty much any game, although it probably wouldn't play particularly well. Actually, I might be wrong about that. It might be very specific to certain games that you have to have mouse and keyboard support. So yeah, being super broke, paying $50 for a game I already know I'm not really that interested in, is almost certainly a mistake, particularly since, now that I think about it, I can just play Borderlands, the pre-sequel, and move forward on my series of covering the Borderlands games and make that contrast. My chart is still doing its thing. You know, there might be an argument to not showing the chart every stream, but then there is possibly an argument to just showing this chart very quickly. This is the struggle for relevancy chart of what games are being played the most over the longest period of time in a year's sample. Once we get to the point that I have a year's worth of samples, so inherently the chart doesn't change too much, as Counter-Strike 2 every time I stream Monday, Wednesday, and Friday is likely going to be in the first spot and thus be given 100 points, whereas Overwatch 2 is likely going to be in the 65th, 64th spot. You can see Overwatch 2 has jumped around a lot more, but averages out at the bottom here with its points to be in the last position. And yeah, the change we've been tracking most is just Black Myth Wukong falling down popularity. And apparently I changed my chart at some point, and so these are the least recent samples, and this is the most recent sample. So it used to be the other way, and I must have tweaked it and not realized I had done that. So yeah, Black Myth Wukong over here is in the 12th spot most recently, whereas previously it was in the top 10. And you can see when it first came out it was in higher spots, second spot for a long time, and first spot for a few days. So as it is falling down in popularity, its total points of 370 will potentially be broken by the total points of Naraka Blade Point, and it will slip to the 5th spot. Thus, over a longer track period of time, it becomes less relevant. Deadlock potentially becomes less relevant too, in the sense that there's just not any new news. So you can see it was at higher numbers in its beta than it is now. Of course, it seems like it's been all over the top 100 charts. At one point there it was in the low numbers. But I call this the struggle for relevancy because the question, which is basically an opinion, is does that make things like Counter-Strike 2 relevant, or does it just prove that Counter-Strike 2 is always going to have a ton of either human players or bots? And we know for a fact that Counter-Strike 2 has a lot of bots in it. And since when this is based off of the total number of players in the 24-hour in a 24-hour time period, the numbers are just always going to be bigger. And an older game like Counter-Strike 2 may just not be that relevant because while its locked-in audience may be huge, it's a lot like talking about fighting games, in that if you're in the fighting game scene, it's big news, but then the vast majority of gamers are not in the fighting game scene and don't really care about fighting games, which is kind of a shame in the fighting game example, because new fighting games do come out, they just don't really ever attract newer players in large numbers, or even try to attract newer players. We can see that there's more of a procedural drop to GTA 5, and then Rust has a fairly large drop, and so the numbers here might shift around a lot more than when we get to Football Manager 2024, a fairly large drop. And something like Football Manager 2024 will potentially fall out of the top 100 very quickly when Football Manager 2025 comes out, but that game has been announced to be delayed also. I don't know if there's a true way to find relevancy, because you just have a lot of gamers that are locked into their same games, Call of Duty, Counter-Strike 2, whatever, Destiny, and they're just playing those games over and over again, year after year, and they really don't care to play anything new, or on very rare occasions they might play one extra new game. A lot of the statistics I think I've seen for like your average Call of Duty player is that they buy maybe 2 or 3 games a year at most, and often it's just Call of Duty, Madden, NBA, EA sports games. And so those gamer bro style of players that only are ever going to play those aren't really part of the same community of gamers, and there really is no community of gamers. It's just that everybody games in the same way that everybody breathes. I wanted to say everybody poops, and I guess that's maybe a little too crass a joke, but the same difference. And so for me, and from my perspective, looking for new games and games with story narratives and games that aren't just hyper multiplayer focused, what is relevant to me personally is definitely not most of the games on this list. In fact, I'm not sure. I'm basically stretching my interest for most of these games, like Deadlock, to be interesting to me. Black Myth Wukong does pique my interest, but it also has that Dark Souls, Demon Souls aura of it where it might be a little too difficult for me. I don't really know what Once Human is, but it might catch my interest. Baldur's Gate 3 would catch my interest for having a story. Monster Hunter World, I could see playing that. Then Sid Meier's Civ 6 is just going to be too complicated, so that'd be no. Elden Ring is probably going to be too difficult, so that would be a no. Dead by Daylight is a multiplayer game, so no. Yeah, so of this entire list, there's really only 4 or 5 things that are personally relevant to me or interesting to me. And of course, you could take a step back and ask, is any of this information helpful at all or necessary? Inherently, I let myself be led around the nose by Giant Bomb many, many years ago, and I let them color my perspective of what gaming was all about way too much. And when I was listening to Giant Bomb, maybe they were somewhat on track for being accurate. Giant Bomb these days is a completely different group of people and completely owned by completely different companies several times over. But yeah, Metacritic, OpenCritic, both of which have become kind of, they've tried to be at least the de facto places where games would get reviewed, but both are also particularly hostile to actual user reviews instead of promoting user reviews. They try to promote mainstream video game journalist websites, which are often little more than a couple of people just running a website on a shoestring budget, and people with really no credibility. And once you actually start to get to know the full history of the people who were running most mainstream video game websites, they might have a long time in which they have been in a position of privilege to talk about video games and put out either website articles or, in many cases, print articles. They don't really have a lot of credibility to be the people talking about video games or judging video games. Community recommends here may start to play and be a lot more useful, I'm noticing, today than I am clicking on more articles just from the front page from the community recommends. And honestly, it's not too hard to be credible as a video game critic. All you really would have to do is say, hey, I have a claim here that most people would believe, in that I grew up playing a bunch of video games, a wide variety of video games. I understand video games and I actually play them to a level of completion so I can tell the full story. And most mainstream video game journalists just can't reach that fairly low bar. Many mainstream video game journalists barely played games or never played games. Sadly, there's a gendered thing there, certainly, that where a lot of the mainstream video game journalists that are female just get brought in because they're female and have played very little video games. That is a thing of the past, in particular, where little girls would have been actively discouraged to play video games. And here we have yet another adult game just right on the front page. That's probably due to my settings. So yeah, people like Morgan Webb, I have no clue how many video games she really played before she was the host of X-Play, but certainly she didn't really stay in that field talking about video games, as far as I could tell, after the fact. I think best I could ever figure is that she played a few games, but she certainly wasn't the ADD or OCD obsessive type of gamer that should have been reviewing games. Although, in fairness to Morgan Webb, she really was just a face for a lot of people who were working behind the scenes to write reviews. Same is true for Adam Sessler, and we see that much more true with Adam Sessler, as he, even when he was being the face, came off as old and weird, and he certainly came off even less relatable when they tried to bring back G4 for the nightmare that was. But yeah, that's still not really enough, because then you do have like Jeff Gersman, I think is the name of the guy, who was in charge of Giant Bomb for a long time and had just garages full of video games. His knowledge and interest seemed to lock too much into old games and not as much as far as an interest in new games, nor in as much of an interest in running Giant Bomb correctly. Yeah, if anything, I think the problem there is that he was just doing minimal amounts of work to maintain a paycheck while he was moving / having another child. He had just kind of grown out of the video game journalism mold, to his own loss, certainly, because Jeff Gersman's YouTube page now is really just absolute garbage for somebody who's been in charge of a mainstream video game journalist site like Giant Bomb for so long. He learned seemingly nothing during his tenure, which might actually have been 10 years. Alright, let's see. Sonic Origins seems to be good, so I'll put that on the wish list. And yeah, in fairness, there just is not a single mainstream video game journalist that I kind of like that I've found. There's some people on YouTube that are tolerable because they stay in a small niche, but those people on YouTube arguably aren't even mainstream. Scott DeWaz, I think, is somewhat tolerable because he's half doing skits and a person and just doing a character as much as he's talking about games. There's a guy named G-Man Lives. I wonder how many of these recommendations of games are just going to be MMOs. Overall, Wayfinder has been 50% positive. Most recently, it has been very positive. That's an interesting thought, but at most that means I can just put the game on the follow list, which at some point I might do some follow list cleanup to see it again. This looks like a weird game that's overwhelmingly positive that I've missed. G-Man Lives on YouTube specifically does center around Doom style, Quake style first person shooter games, Duke Nukem type games. With that does put you in a unique point where if you're watching one of his videos, you know what you're going to get. And then you have people like Video Game Donkey, I believe, where the whole point of the video is not to really talk about video games, but just do a skit. And I can't really call those video game journalists, can I? So his skits might be good. But the vast majority of somebody who got paid by somebody else, which would be a good line to call mainstream, is that are you running your own show, or are you getting paid by some kind of publishing company? Have you found other people who are making other content, or are you doing it solo or mostly solo in the case that you might have a thumbnail creator or an editor, but you're not actively trying to do a whole group thing. And most of the group sites, like The Escapist, is kind of an example of that, which The Escapist originally felt very small, but has now just felt like it at some point evolved into being more mainstream, and now that The Escapist has fallen apart under many controversies, it is just under this shroud of more negativity than it's really worth as far as controversies go. And I never got into reading any articles or any real reviews from The Escapist. It was just Yahtzee Crenshaw doing his little videos of rambling with the little animations. And weirdly, that puts you into this bigger point on YouTube where video game content is very prevalent on YouTube, but never promoted and never popular. So like the biggest gamers on YouTube are probably more just like Twitch streamers than anything else. And at one point the biggest gamer definitely was just PewDiePie because of just glitches in the algorithm more than anything. And PewDiePie isn't a gamer playing games on this channel anymore. And yeah, the biggest, most successful under PewDiePie are just Minecraft streamers, where yeah, that's just little kids. So my channel was probably doomed to fail from the beginning because I wanted more of a mature adult coverage of games and something more intellectual, and the algorithm is just designed for Elsa-gate nonsense, or at least it was at one point, and very young kid content. By far one of my most successful videos was an experiment where I made Minecraft doing the Wheels on the Bus song in the background while jumping around a Minecraft bus. Yeah, very low effort content and very much not adult or intellectual content, and yet it is certainly evergreen content that just constantly gets views, and I knew it was going to at that point, and I knew that I could potentially devolve my channel into just a content farm if I wanted to, and still probably wouldn't be that successful. The Lego games I've covered, which are more kid-friendly, have gotten significantly more responses than, say, Binding of Isaac content, which I would be more interested in doing that. Anyways, I guess I'm in just kind of a retrospective mood today. We're supposed to be covering video game news, and inherently I screw myself over by always going on a rant for 30 minutes before the news even starts. Which, yeah, I don't know. I did do a hard reboot on my internet, and it did seem like at some point I was going to be dropping frames, but then it seems like that has stopped. That being said, I don't feel like the streaming quality here is particularly good, but at least I'll keep an eye on it and see if it's just going to be dropping frames here and there, or if it just needed to catch up at a certain point. Let's go through the Video Games Chronicle articles. Let's see. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet trading card game Prismatic Evolutions have been announced. The sets will focus on Eevee and its evolutions, which this leads me directly into another rant. The Pokemon trading card game is now available for, I believe, iOS and Android. I know it's for Android at least. And first of all, I think it's worth pointing out that there's been no less than 9 other Pokemon games released for mobile before this game, before they got to the trading card game, and there has not been a single game, even now, that is in any way close to an actual Pokemon game that you would have gotten on a Nintendo console, where it would have been fairly easy to re-release Pokemon Green and Red, or Gold and Silver, some of those first generation Pokemon games on mobile, just through a emulator. You could certainly have tried to remake it and make it better. They effectively did remake the first generation of Pokemon games for the Switch, so when doing that they could have scaled down the graphics a little bit for mobile, and nowadays a mobile phone probably could play a Switch game with the exact same level of graphics, and it would just be a matter of getting the screen size and ratio correct. And inherently Nintendo could be at the forefront of what I think is going to be eventually a revolution of Microsoft, PlayStation, and Nintendo just selling controllers that hook up to your cell phone, and cell phone gaming with a controller is just going to be the thing. And the Joy-Cons are the smallest controllers by far. It is feasible you could put Joy-Cons in your pocket, maybe with a slight design so that the analog sticks don't break off in your pocket, but it does definitely feel like that would be the way to go for mobile gaming. But yeah, to get back to the Pokemon trading card game on Android, it is extremely bare bones. They advertised it with the idea that you would jump into the art of the cards. That happens with one Pikachu card that I've seen so far. I've gotten 198 cards. None of the other cards are at a visual quality that does that. If you get duplicates of cards, because this is a gacha game and you're just trying to get one copy of every single card or 2 copies of every single card, I think it is just the same old Pokemon card game. They've kind of hidden away the energy cards and de-emphasized that, but it does just seem to me like that is still the somebody is ringing my doorbell, but it is just a package delivery, so I don't have to worry about it. I could hear them outside. But yeah, it looks to me like it is just the basic Wizards of the Coast approved trading card game of Pokemon. It doesn't seem like they're changing anything. And Pokemon as a card game, as I've now played several games, is just too simplistic, really, for anybody under over the age of like 10. It's just not anywhere close to Yu-Gi-Oh! The cards don't have synergies. They don't really do much. You have a few trainer cards that might affect how the outcome is. Otherwise, it's just a Pokemon that does an attack. In fact, at least as far as I've gotten in actually playing, it is like probably about 5 times more simpler to play the Pokemon trading card game than it is to play just a Pokemon RPG on the Switch or something, or the Game Boy, even those first generation games, because I don't think that there's really statistics for like confusion or being put to sleep, things like that. None of the Pokemon permanently evolve or have skill up things. I imagine there's little trainer cards that do that, but yeah, very, very simple. Perhaps even more simple than whatever Yu-Gi-Oh! Rush may be, if Yu-Gi-Oh! Rush ever does become a thing in digital format. But the Pokemon trading card game doesn't even let you play a game of Pokemon until you're up to level 3. So your introduction into the game is going to be introduced into the it feels like at least 5 different currencies, and the very first thing you're doing is opening packs, and the game is 100% focused on you opening packs, which makes it a very boring game where every 12 hours it's going to try to get you to come back and open another pack and look at the storefront and look at things that can be purchased with real world money after you buy some Pokegold to confuse how much money you're actually spending. And it's not until you're at the 3rd level that you find that there's a button in the lower right corner that takes you to the actual menu to play Pokemon. And there's some solo games, and then there's player versus player games, but it is not in any way focused around that. You would like to see that evolve into mini tournaments very quickly. You would like to see the Pokemon card game be more emphasized and more on the front page, but that's not what this is about. This is about getting digital versions of the Pokemon cards, which if you wait long enough time, if you just played this game while having basically no fun for years, you probably would get all the Pokemon cards, depending on how many different expansions like this they're going to come out with and how quickly they come out with them. I imagine that there has just been tons of these, and maybe some of these newer uh, cards have just new effects. Certainly, when I first played the Pokemon trading card game, the EX cards didn't exist, but I'm not sure what the EX cards even really do. But yeah, day to day, you're really not going to have that much fun. There's no grinding, really. You can get rewarded after the first victories or accomplishing goals by playing solo, but after that, I don't think you're going to get the main currency, which the main currency is just Pokemon hourglasses, which reduce the wait time of 12 hours before you can open another pack. There's like 3 different animations you have to sit through when you open a pack to get cards and register them into your database. And when you have more than 2 copies of a card, then you start to get Stardust, and the Stardust puts just pathetic little visual effects over the cards in the same way that Marvel Snap did, where you are just constantly evolving the Marvel Snap cards up into different visual effects. Although, in the case of the Pokemon TCG mobile game, it doesn't seem like it's as bad as Marvel Snap, because it seems like it is a very linear line of the visual effects that you can evolve it to, and that it doesn't prestige and reset after a point. So it seems like once you get all the visual effects on the card, you will just have all the visual effects on the cards, but it's not redrawing any of the imagery, it's just putting sparkles over it. Low effort content creation. So at the moment, while playing it, I'm going to play it a little bit longer, but I'm not thinking I would recommend the Pokemon trading card game to kids. It's just too much of a gacha game, too much greediness. Problem with almost every mobile game in existence is just repeated here. You certainly could lock down a phone and make it so it's impossible for them to buy things, but the kids would just feel very left out, as they're going to have a pathetically small amount of cards that they can play with. You can rent decks a couple of times. If you unlock the rental decks, you have to unlock rental decks, then rent them, which could get you maybe 1 victory playing against your friends. And frankly, since I start with the premise that Pokemon as a trading card game is probably a little too simplistic for anybody over to the age of 10, it's probably also the case that kids under the age of 10 shouldn't have cell phones, or at least their own cell phones, to the point where they're putting games on them and playing games. I doubt the Pokemon TCG would look any better at all on an iPad, if it can install and run on an iPad. And you know, there's just major problems in it. You have just a bench of 3 Pokemon that you set up, and then that's kind of it. You need like a trainer card, or you need to let one of your characters die before you could play a 4th basic Pokemon. If a Pokemon retreats, it just swaps into the bench, and whatever you pick to replace it moves into the single attack lane in the Pokemon trading card game. I imagine there are some trainer cards that lets you change that, but yeah, it's just not that complicated of a game. Whereas my criticism of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that it's too complicated of a game. Pokemon has always been too simplistic, and Magic the Gathering has just always been too greedy. And frankly, since Wizards of the Coast helped create the Pokemon trading card game in the West, it too is just too greedy. Now, in contrast, it probably is cheaper, or at least more space efficient, to do it digitally than it is to do it in the real world. Of course, you don't get fancy accessory packs. And let's just talk about the elephant in the room. It's always been the case that a lot of cards, trading cards, and in my days when I was very young, there was also sticker packs, and bubble card, baseball trading card things, and comic books. All of those were on the shelves with a general assumption that a percentage, kind of a high percentage of kids were just shoplifting those and stealing those. But yeah, even today, I would say there's probably a fairly high level of shoplifting of Pokemon cards off of shelves in stores. And they do minimal to combat it because Pokemon cards aren't that valuable. And if anything, it might be a case where is it more of a loss to lose what is probably a few pennies of Pokemon cards versus even 50 cents of a candy bar, which would potentially be also what young, not knowing any better kids might steal. Now you're getting into bigger time small theft if you're capable of shoplifting a big box like this. But yeah, this expansion adds 175 cards. The first expansion in the card game has, I think, 226 cards or so, and I have 190 of them already, and then I suspect I might get all 226 fairly quickly, and then it would just unlock the next expansion after that, giving me even more to collect and even more packs to open, which I just don't find. They've spent a lot of time trying to make the card pack opening experience fun, but I've never really seen it be particularly fun in any game, and the Pokemon trading card game is no different. Inherently, it wouldn't even be a game that would be good to have as like a backup game like Yu-Gi-Oh here. Not that I'm playing Yu-Gi-Oh anymore, because there's just not a lot to do. It's tolerable to play maybe one or two Pokemon games, and that's it. And the Nintendo connotation, since Nintendo owns a large portion of the Pokemon companies, would run the risk of DMCA strikes if I was to try to run some kind of emulator on Windows to make footage of it. Although, particularly, I don't talk about hardware too much, but I am perking up my ears about the next generation of AMD CPU and GPU technology, because I'm thinking all AMD build in the next year or two, running either SteamOS if it comes out for PC, or Bakelite or Chimera OS as my main factor, and whatever Linux it's running at that point probably has a high chance of being able to use Waydroid to run an Android game, any Android game, and show that off. But there also would probably be some minimal growing pains of moving applications over. It also occurred to me that all these macros and advanced scene switcher scripts and programs that I do, I really just need to make a private GitHub repository and put backups of all of that into the GitHub repository every time I make a change, uploading that new change. That way I just have a good in the cloud versioning system where when I make a change I know what I'm doing, and I'm forced to be a little bit better about documenting what I'm doing. I've really wish Git as a software and GitHub as a website existed when I was being taught programming. Although in fairness, when I was taught programming, the computers weren't even really connected to the internet. But yeah, had that level of documentation been taught to me, and it's not like documentation didn't exist, it was just, it was not emphasized to me at all. Nowhere well enough. I should have been putting a comment basically before and after every group of lines of code that did a single thing. I should be making code to only really do a single thing in most cases. And yeah, that stuff was just not emphasized well enough. Moving on with Video Games Chronicle news, since I've only gone through one story so far. Dragon Age the Veilguard tops the Steam charts, breaking BioWare's concurrent player record. EA's latest has knocked Black Ops 6 off the #1 slot. What chart are they referring to here? Top seller chart, I guess. Okay. And certainly that is another struggle for relevancy, as far as, is it more relevant that new game to look at new games that are being bought versus looking at games that are actually being played? For publishers and game developers, certainly that would be the number to look at to see what games are being purchased regardless of whether people are playing it or not. But from a gamer perspective, what people are playing should be key, which that inherently would disenfranchise small short games where a lot of people might buy a 5-hour game and play it, but if they played it over the course of a year and only a few people played it every week throughout that year, that would never get into the top concurrent chart, and it would feel like an irrelevant game because of that, even if sales numbers were very high. And it's very rare, in fairness, that there would be a case where just a ton of people bought something. Black Ops might be the one game where a ton of people might buy it and play it very little, but almost in every other case, if your people are buying a game, they're going to play it for at least a little while during its launch week and its launch window. Overall, they're not going to just buy a game and then put it under the Christmas tree. The only games that really would be purchased and put under a Christmas tree and then wait several months before it's played would be probably Nintendo games, which don't make Steam charts anyways. PlayStation CEO, which one I would wonder, says that the PS5 Pro was a 5-year project. Development started before the PS5 launch. Hideaki Nishino says that the updated console was always part of the plan. I mean, that's certainly believable. Seems to be like that is the standard way in which all PlayStations since I think the PS3 Pro existed. Is the argument being made now that it will be 5 more years until we get a PS6? Or is the argument being made that 5 years ago the PS5 Pro was started development, so potentially 4 years ago the PS6 started development, and next year a PS6 might get released? I would suspect we will see a PS6 in the next 2 or 3 years. Probably not next year. I think Sony in particular will be stuck in the mud with the idea of new consoles, whereas Microsoft is moving in a very different direction, in that they're trying to redefine what a console is and get away from making another Xbox, since they're not inherently making money by making more Xboxes, and they're all in on just being more of a publisher. But Sony is going to want to compete with Nintendo, and if Nintendo is releasing a new console in the first quarter of 2025, then I feel like Sony is going to feel that urge to compete with them, even though whatever Nintendo comes out with is probably going to be very underpowered. I saw slick deals for the Backbone controller thing that Sony came out with, down to $60 from $100. It was always overpriced, so even at $60, it's still probably overpriced, but maybe they're clearing out and giving up on that so that a new, more powerful mobile platform might be their thing. Sony certainly could win the next generation by coming out with some kind of Steam Deck Switch-like device that is just a lot more powerful. If it can potentially promise more than the Steam Deck does, or come in cheaper than the Steam Deck does, there definitely would be a market for that. Yeah, I don't really have a lot of hope of Sony doing that correctly and coming out with a decent portable type console, Switch clone, Steam Deck clone, something in the middle of that. They could come out with a more expensive than the Steam Deck, more powerful device, and that might be where they want to land. And there might be a sales pitch for that too. Sony, seemingly by default, seems to have won this generation as far as the number of people that actually play console games. Seemingly, again, not by actually doing anything right, just by Microsoft not also doing anything right, and PS3 doing something right, and PS4 doing something right. Good Old Games is giving away a free game as part of its Halloween sale. Return of the Phantom is entirely free to claim until November 9th. It is a DRM free, not on Steam game, and it is a very old point and click game, so not sure how many people really are going to care too much about that. The first game footage of Ghostface in Mortal Kombat 1 has been revealed. I guess it's just a screenshot in this tweet, and that's it. Astrobot's third speedrun level is available now. Sony closed Concord Studio Firewalk to further its monopoly in games, a labor body says. Sony's announced this week that Firewalk would close along with the mobile studio Neon Koi. I guess the accusation of furthering a monopoly is probably a great accusation for the CWA, Communication Workers of America, to make, but the logic eludes me, I suppose, as to how you really get to that point without... I see the beginning and the end. What's the middle step there? Yes, almost certainly any company that shuts down a studio or lays off people is doing it to improve its place in the market, improve its business situation. And if a company already probably is a monopoly, then that would be furthering its monopoly position. But yeah, it is also a hard argument to say Sony is really a monopoly as far as game development goes, though there's just so many other companies and publishers, first party developers, second party developers, third party developers. But on the other hand, what is CWA going to say? They're going to say the most attractive things to the US government to see if the US government might slap Sony down for shutting down the Firewalk studios and laying off all those employees. The Communication Workers of America have one job as a labor union, which is to support the laborers any way possible, even if that is making nebulous claims or spurious claims. They have to fight dirty just to barely stay on par and match the dirty tactics of management. But yeah, it is good news that we're seeing labor unions start to speak out and start to take an active interest in the video game industry. Maybe 10-20 years from now, the video game industry would just become heavily unionized, and there would be just a lot more protections, and it would be a much better place to much better industry to work in. Although that tends not to be the case. By the time a union comes into the place, the jobs tend to be more like factory working jobs that might pay well and might have good benefits, but they tend not to be that creative or fun to work in. There's just this overhead of aggression between the union and the management by that point, and that makes it less fun to work in a lot of places. So yeah, I would like to see the game industry be a much better place to work in for the future generations of programmers. At this point, I doubt I would be ever in the video game industry, even though that was something I wanted to do when I was younger. I think I'm probably just a little too old at this point to break into the market, unless I was going to start my own company somehow and be my own boss. And even then, I don't think my programming is up to snuff. I more than likely should be closer to an executive producer or director, somebody in charge of making the big decisions while letting newer people use newer programming techniques to actually program the games. Todd Howard originally didn't want Troy Baker to star in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. The game is going to feature Baker's voice and the likeness of Harrison Ford, which I'm sure Harrison Ford has licensed his likeness or sold it away completely, but doesn't want to actually go into a booth doing voice acting. I don't think Harrison Ford particularly wants to do too much as far as acting. He's old and I think happy to be mostly retired at this point. So that might be an odd combination. Troy Baker, I believe, does a lot of the voice acting in video games, so he might be able to do a good younger Harrison Ford impression, and so it might not be that noticeable either. Of course, my concern with Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is not the voice acting, and definitely my concern is not whatever Todd Howard wants. If anything, doing the opposite of what Todd Howard wants is probably a check mark in my book. My concern is that there's just a lot of news stories coming out about Indiana Jones and the Great Circle and hype and promotion for a game that I think is going to be surprisingly different from what people are expecting. This is also a page where I want to see if I can get this white line to disappear on the edge. So I'm going to try and tweak that, and I want to get the pictures bigger, because when Video Games Chronicles headlines don't go to a third line, it leaves a third line here. Call of Duty's development structure won't change under Microsoft. 15 different Activision studios are currently working on the franchise. That's an insane statement to make, in my opinion, because when you have the second headline saying 15 different studios are working on the franchise of Call of Duty, that does not mean 15 games are being developed. And the one thing that Microsoft acquiring Activision Blizzard should do is change the development structure for the better merge teams or build new teams. They could be better teams, and just flatten the ladder, corporate ladder structuring of things. Although, on the other hand, maybe it is the case that you need 15 different teams because there's just 15 different groups of people that would not get along well if you put them all in the same room. Maybe people are that bristly these days, and that you have to make teams of maybe 10 or 20 people to work together in small groups versus a team of 100 people where that would just be too many emails and too much conversation in particular. Yeah. There is definitely an argument for keeping people isolated in smaller groups and saying, here's your one developer, here's your one animator, here's your one programmer, here's your one audio effects animator. Have that group of 4 people make just one character and one gun, or make a bunch of guns but only guns, or make a bunch of characters but only characters, instead of having just a laundry list of different things people could be working on in a group of 200 people. Let's see, moving on. PlayStation's Wolverine director has taken over the Xbox's Perfect Dark. The Ratchet and Clank leads will now helm Insomniac's Marvel title. So this is like 2 changes. Seems like in 2 different headlines. Should be probably 2 stories. So the creative director of PlayStation's Wolverine game has joined Xbox's The Initiative to helm a Perfect Dark reboot, which speaks to how little progress has been made since the last trailer from the Perfect Dark reboot. So, as game designer Brian Horton, who was previously named as creative director in Insomniac's Marvel Wolverine title of 2021, left the studio in the summer. So, I don't remember this Wolverine game too much. I think it was fine but not great. Now, Wolverine is being led by the design duo behind 2021's Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart creative director Marcus Smith and game director Mike Daly, which Sony seems to love to do this, where they're not putting any single person in charge anymore, instead giving co-authority to 2 people, which is a dumb idea. So this Wolverine game, I guess, is still in development. Wolverine's previously announced game director Cameron Christian will reportedly remain in the studio in a different role. So this is just a whole shuffling of the deck chairs of the Wolverine game in particular, which apparently is still in development. And yeah, Wolverine, I imagine, is still somewhat popular, but 2-3 years from now, I don't know how popular he'll be. I don't think we're gonna have too many more Wolverine movies getting made. Anyways, Nintendo, once again doing weird things, has put out a music app on mobile, which it seems like this is Nintendo's strategy, and probably has been their strategy for a while, is to put out cell phone apps that add extra features to the Nintendo Switch Online membership. it lets you listen to their curated collection of Nintendo music, but you must have a Nintendo Switch Online membership activated. So you're paying that $30 a year to have it, and I assume if you shut off the membership, then you can't listen to the music anymore. It is seemingly designed in a way so it's just like 8-bit tunes to study to style music, and yeah, I doubt it's particularly a good way to introduce kids into music, and that you're introducing them to Nintendo video game music that's mostly just background music, and frankly that encourages having background noise in your room, which, if you're going to have background noise in your room, there's plenty of podcasts where you could learn something new barely listening to it, or there's more classical music and other kinds of music that you should be listening to, things with lyrics, things that are just going to be a little bit more relevant. I would much prefer kids to just listen to a collection of like Mozart and Bach than background music of Nintendo games. You listen to the Nintendo music when you're playing the game. Don't make your entire life about listening to the same old Nintendo songs. The other major Nintendo apps that have come out, I looked at practically all of them, is there is a parental controls app, there is a chat app for Nintendo Switch Online where you can chat with friends. So they're just kind of trying to have features that don't really make a lot of sense on the Switch be on the cell phone, perhaps assuming that parents can just control the cell phone apps more. Although in the case of this music app, it doesn't make a lot of sense that you couldn't just have this installed on a Nintendo Switch to play Nintendo music. And still, it's not a music player, which is really what you would want. It is crazy that there isn't at least a music player, probably a video player app that just could be installed on the Nintendo Switch. If you want to play video on the Nintendo Switch right now, the best suggestion someone can make is to upload it to your own YouTube channel and then watch it through the YouTube app. That's insane, and that doesn't work if you're putting copyrighted content on your YouTube channel, because that'll just get struck immediately. Yes, they came out with Mario Run, and there's a Mario Kart game, and so there's a couple of Mario games. They've just come out with the complete version of Animal Crossing from Nintendo. The Pokemon trading card game is not from Nintendo, it's from the Pokemon Company, which is owned, a third of which is owned by Nintendo, but different company. Pokemon Go is Niantic also as the publisher. But yeah, as far as actually putting out entertaining content or experiences on mobile, Nintendo has done a very poor job, and they don't seem to have any interest in it. Speaking of the weirdness of Nintendo, someone has figured out a way to hack and upload custom firmware to the Alarmio alarm clock, which in the teardowns does have millimeter wave, I think it's 24 gigahertz millimeter wave presence sensors installed in it. So that's how it is seeing you roll over in bed or stand up completely, which I thought it was possible that they went cheap and had just infrared motion detectors installed around the bevel of the screen, but no, they have gone to millimeter wave, which will give them more precise data, but clearly not precise enough data to know if there are two people in bed, or to do anything particularly interesting with the technology of selling a $100 alarm clock that does very little. I would assume this Nintendo Music app is at some point maybe going to try and connect to the Alarmio, and that there might just be the synergy of here are the tunes in the Nintendo Music app you can select to play on the Alarmio. If there was a limited Bluetooth speaker type functionality on the Alarmio, at least it would be more useful. It doesn't seem like there is any Bluetooth connectivity on the Alarmio so far as I've heard on the teardowns. And even though they've been able to put custom firmware, I don't know what particularly interesting you could do with a custom firmware. There is a loop feature so that you can just loop for up to 60 minutes some of the songs, and that's about the biggest sales points for the Nintendo Music app. I installed the app and immediately it just asked for the Nintendo Switch Online membership, so couldn't go any further with that. Black Ops 6 launch was the biggest Call of Duty release ever, Microsoft claims, setting a record for day one players as well as Game Pass subscriber ads. Which, yeah, being integrated in the Game Pass, obviously it would be the biggest release ever, although it may not have been the most profitable one as far as the amount of people that actually paid for Black Ops 6 exclusively versus people who bought just Game Pass to get it. Activision has driven a 43% jump in Microsoft's quarterly gaming revenue. And then the update to this article says Microsoft says the monthly active user reached all-time highs and Game Pass set quarter one revenue records. So clearly by those statistics they should be happy on that financial level. PS5 Slim console covers reportedly are not compatible with PS5 Pro. So, yeah, that seems crazy that they would not fit. The whole design of the PS5 has always been a crazy design. Anyways. Cyberpunk 2077 Ultimate Edition is coming to the Mac. It'll be available in early 2025. Interesting. It'll be very interesting to see such a CPU and GPU intensive game being ported to Mac's M3 or M4 chipsets. Just to see how well that might actually perform. Although, even if it does start to realize, like, see, this is supposed to be Apple, but the emoji for Apple here barely will be recognizable for the Apple logo from the Apple company. Even if M3 and M4 chipsets somehow are very good at playing games, Apple themselves is never going to be interested in games, so not anytime soon. Maybe 10 years from now they might be interested in gaming. So it is still incredibly stupid to buy a Mac if you're going to plan on doing any gaming on it. And in general, I think it's kind of incredibly stupid to buy a Mac at all. I'll grant people a reprieve if they like iPads and iPhones. Sure, you're baked into that infrastructure. You don't want the mess of learning Android, and you don't want the mess of figuring out whether you want Samsung's One UI on Android or Google's Pixel's style of Android, or any other Motorola style of Android, or HTC style of Android. There's just several major brands that have skinned Android to look differently, and so there is inconsistencies there. But I guess generally I'd probably recommend Samsung, because that's the one I've been with longest, but I am willing to experiment with something different next time I get a phone. But yeah, I can't recommend Mac for anything at this point. It's not good for Photoshop. It's not good for video editing. It's not good for audio editing. If you're going to do any of that, potentially you could do a lot of it on Linux, but you would just buy a laptop or a computer and run Windows to do any of that. Maybe you could get an open source type hardware like the framework, which I think is open source hardware as far as a laptop, although that really wouldn't change your operating system. Again, nowadays if you were going to build a new computer or spec out a new computer, AMD CPU and AMD GPU potentially is the way to go. And so the Intel NVIDIA path, which used to be the default path for making gaming PCs, has no longer, doesn't really make sense anymore. Moving on. A new Switch system update fixes GameCube controllers and sleep mode issues. New update is available to download now. November's PlayStation Plus Essential games have been announced, with Hot Wheels Unleashed 2 Turbocharged, Ghostwire Tokyo, and a new release Death Note Killer Within. Interesting. So, straight up, a new release. It's also coming to PC next week, and it's based off of the Death Note anime, which, I mean, that manga and that anime ended. They probably are at a point now where it would make sense for there to be a repeated, rebooted series of Death Note. But yeah, that certainly could happen, and that you could have a new Kira type character show up maybe decades later after the events of the first Death Note, or you could have a completely different universe. Like an alternate universe in particular would kind of make more sense. If here's what would happen had the Death Note fallen into the hands of somebody else, somebody different than Light. So this looks like this is very much a silly, ridiculous social deduction game that has gotten the skin of Death Note around it, and inherently just loses all the over-the-top drama of the Death Note anime. Yeah, I don't know if you really would be able to write different types of deaths, and the game figures it out. So basically this is like Clue, or if you were to make your own kind of weird Clue game. And I have to say this, as much as it is, in my opinion, worth watching Death Note once, maybe rewatching it every 10 to 15 years, if you're super obsessed with Death Note right now, you're probably kind of a loser, for lack of a nicer way to say it. Like, there's just no relevant reason to be obsessed with Death Note right now. We've had our fun, in particular, with like the live action Death Note movie too. But yeah, if you watched it once, that's kind of all you can do. It would be nice if there was an alternate universe reboot type series. Code Geass has that going on right now, and I think Code Geass was a couple years earlier than Death Note, so it's possible we will see something like that. But yeah, Death Note itself as an anime and manga falls into the problem of there was a whole bunch of rules that were just constantly being revealed about how the Death Note works, and that was a lot of the intrigue. But it also creates a system where people get obsessed with the rules and want to know how specific scenarios play out. And so you could make a whole reboot series where it's just questions and answers of his fandoms asking this specific scenario, what does the creator think would have happened in that case. Yeah, and I guess I have nothing else to say, so let's move on. Let's see. The ex-PlayStation boss, I believe this is Sean Layden, says platform holders must do more to restore the AA games category. Sean Layden wants console makers to foster games between GTA and Among Us. Again, I don't think he's in any level of influence, so this really is more of a just comment from somebody who was influential. But I don't particularly disagree with the sentiment either. It does make a lot of sense that the AAA and now some companies claiming quadruple A development concepts need to be reduced severely, and we need to get back to single A's and AA games, because it's diminishing returns, and inherently the tentpole concept of having AAA games make a ton of money to fund the development of AA and single A games has fallen apart, and it is now very much more a case where a tentpole game is making a ton of money in very rare occasions, and all the profits from that tentpole game is being put into developing the next tentpole game. Which, what's the point of a tent that only holds itself up and does not hold up the actual shorter poles? That just turns it into a closed umbrella, effectively. World of Warcraft inspired menus coming to Shake Shack next month. Some of this is older news. Ubisoft has quietly launched a Web3 competitive turn-based RPG. I haven't heard anybody else even mention this game. So yeah, they've been really quiet about it. That brings us to the Gematsu articles, an hour and 30 minutes into the stream. I am too slow. Venus Vacation Prism Dead or Alive Extreme adds Nanami, launching March 6th in Japan and Asia, not coming apparently to the West. So this is Misaki, which I think we'd already looked at Misaki. Age 18. Hey, so we're getting some details as far as what is going to be the minimum age of these characters. And they're giving bust, waist, hip ratios in the information too. So like all these characters have been extremely large in the bust and the hip ratios, which feels very weird to have just that one style. 18-year-old student is Misaki. Next we have Fiona, 18-year-old princess. And let's see, this is 88, 55, 84, 85, 54, 89. So they're giving small inch differences, which I don't really believe in the depictions that there would be that big of a difference for what's being shown. Here you have a 22-year-old life coach. There you have a 22-year-old fashion designer. There you have an 18-year-old student. 18-year-old student. So there is very much a defaulting to 18-year-olds in the descriptions. But yeah, they just have massive busts, which, unless you're going to get, they say they all had breast augmentation surgery, being that they probably are Asian characters, that just seems unbelievable. This might be the last character for the game. Yeah, you could also, I guess, claim that they're like post-birth, that they've just given birth to a child and thus they have swelling breasts that way. That would be the only other anatomical explanation, I would believe, unless they were just on some kind of medication. But yeah, I am generally assuming that this dating simulator game has no more characters, and looking at the fact that a significant portion of the characters are being listed as 18, and that they aren't even really trying to mix it up by saying somebody is like 19 or 20 just to keep it in that range, that my tinfoil hat conspiracy feels more true, that they are bending over backwards to avoid being attacked by Western journalism, and so they've made all of the characters' bodies look as mature as I think their animators know how to make them, with just large busts and large hips, while in the story calling them 18-year-olds, when visually that just doesn't make the most sense. The only other thought is that there was just one animator put in charge of making all the body models, and he had a specific fetish, but even if that was the case, I don't think it's particularly that good, because if it was the fact that you just like big hips in particular, then why is it that each of these characters have really gone out of their way to hide the hips? Like, you get the hint of it, but these skirts are fairly long. This is the shortest one, and yeah. Or if you just had a big bust fetish, then why is it that several of these characters are fairly covered up in the cleavage department? Yeah. I think that they are actively damaging a game here that may not have been that good anyways, by, in an effort to avoid criticism, which will inevitably come anyways. And weirdly, they may just get criticism from the other side in that the character designs are not diverse, in that the game itself may be boring visually. And see, if that was going to be the characters in the fighting game, if those are the character models of the female fighters in Dead or Alive, it may very well trickle down to Dead or Alive being visually boring from the fighting characters. And inherently, I just saw on Reddit that there was a study done, particularly in fighting games, that said female fighting game players, I don't know how many of those really exist, preferred to play the more sexualized characters in fighting games, even though they didn't like the more sexualized characters. That is probably in part because the more sexualized characters are probably the better characters in fighting games, so you might very well have a chicken and egg situation. But yeah, I wouldn't say that dating sim spin-off of Dead or Alive game we were just looking at is doing Dead or Alive any favors, other than the fact that those games are always being made to just improve the visual rendering technology, the underlying hair movement technology, twisting and turning technology, lighting technologies, that they are experimental games that are being sold to recoup some of the development time of those experimental games. Let's see. Is this pronounced Shawa American Story? Launching in 2025. It has a 5-minute trailer. Apparently it is a apocalyptic romance RPG. That is weird. Even the thumbnail here looks weird. So you have like these kimono wearing zombies. I think this is probably in part being inspired by something like Death Stranding, as far as just what is the weirdest things we can get away with. So there's a motorcycle, and then motorcycle, drill head thing, Neo Yokohama. Well, I'm always excited about the idea of just going insanely crazy, having a Japanese person go insanely crazy as far as what they're doing. I always have to be kind of cautious too, because this is usually the type of game that is just like ridiculously silly. Yeah, this definitely has the feel of potentially being something like I think they were called Kaizo games, translating directly to like poop game shit games, like Oni Chambara. And so this may just be a lot of monster zombies hack and slash with a lot of silliness in other elements. I guess what this might turn into is something closer to Lollipop Chainsaw style game as far as silliness goes, but even sillier. And maybe that's what this is trying to do, is trying to be, what would Lollipop Chainsaw be if you made a modern Lollipop Chainsaw game and added a bunch of Death Stranding. But yeah, boy is that a lot to take in. PlayStation 4 version is also no longer planned. Hey, well, let's see if there's a Steam link. Guess there is. And that tells me once again that Komatsu's Steam links are still not opening. The Otome visual novel Dynamic Chord Fet Rev Parfait Remaster Edition has been announced for Switch. That was a mouthful. Also, Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake launch trailer is available on Komatsu if you want to check that out. I imagine it's not particularly that interesting to look at. A fantasy beat-em-up game, Blades and Battles, has been announced for all consoles and PC. See, that one did work. So, right, I think that one was already open. So, there is, I imagine, a case here where I'm looking for the word Steam and for it to be a link. But sometimes I'm finding links that have on PC comma Steam. And so that may not be matching. In this case, there is no Steam link. There's a PC link, but that's just going to take me to the tag of PC. Accolade Sports Collection has been announced for all consoles and PC. Includes Summer Challenge, Winter Challenge, Hardball, Hardball 2, and Hoops, Shut Up and Jam. Not sure I'd recognize any of these games. These all sound like incredibly old games. Yeah, they are. NES, Super NES, maybe games, but probably not even Super NES games. Though in fairness, the visuals do look a little bit better than what you'd expect from NES. This seems more like Sega Genesis style games. Rage of Dragons Neo launches November 14th. It's a 2002 release 2D fighting game returning. A whole collection of characters here. Don't recognize this game though, and so yeah, I don't know how to really feel about a fighting game coming back. Inherently, I just don't think I could ever really do a huge deep dive in fighting games personally. I'm going to struggle to play even the biggest of the fighting games. Even like Mortal Kombat, I've never really gotten around to it. Who cared? Glover for the PS4 and 5, Xbox One Series and Switch launches in 2025, going full circle and bringing Glover back to consoles from where it was. I didn't hear a lot of positivity about the PC re-release remaster of Glover. I think in part there might have been a Nintendo 64 source that was used for Glover, where perhaps the PlayStation version of Glover that was released later would have been the better source to use. I remember playing Glover when I was a kid, but also I don't feel any need to play it again. It is definitely one of these older games that probably should have gotten a remaster much earlier. Before everything had been remastered, it probably would have gotten a few more sales had they been first to market. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 has a Betting Man trailer, which I have no clue how many articles and trailers we've seen about Vampire Masquerade's Bloodlines 2 at this point. It seems like a lot. Although this is one of the things that also occurred to me when playing Torchlight 2, is that it is kind of weird that Torchlight 2 really is still just falling into the same kind of monster set that almost every game does, Diablo in particular, when you could have nowadays very easily vampires be your monster set that you're attacking and fighting, or werewolves, or more universal monsters, mummies, things like that. You could also have cryptids. You could have a lot of the Japanese monsters like the slit mouth woman as your enemies, and it's nice to see like Ghostwire Tokyo go in that direction and say, let's make some new monsters based on other mythos. And then there are a few games they've just made completely new characters and monsters to fight. Torchlight 2 does have some Cthulhu-esque characters that show up in a few dungeons, but it is also very heavily influenced by showing you fairly basic characters and repeating a lot of content from the first game. That being said, I'm still having a lot of fun with Torchlight 2, enough that there is just a small danger I'd want to play a New Game Plus, but I doubt I'd actually ever do that. Apparently a new SpongeBob SquarePants game by THQ Nordic is coming in 2025, which I guess that is now just going to be their bread and butter, since that has been probably their most successful releases, is just remasters and I guess maybe now new games from SpongeBob SquarePants, and specifically not even Nickelodeon properties in general. But my biggest hope with THQ Nordic is that they would just stay around enough to get enough money to finish the Darksiders series on a good note. My biggest fear is that they would end the Darksiders series on a bad note, or never end it which would even be a worse note. And I think it's slightly more possible that that's going to happen. And we've heard not much of anything from Embracer Group as the parent company lately, so I guess maybe no news is good news, but it is certainly a case where there's a lot of mess left still from Embracer Group and their poor management decisions of acquiring companies and then really not empowering any of the companies to actually make and release games up until this point. Maybe at some point they'll have 4 or 5 games that all release in the same year and then things would change, but so far they haven't actually accomplished that. Snow Brothers Wonderland has added a PC version and has a multiplayer trailer. Snow Brothers, also being kind of an old game, would be hard to justify in my mind as far as something I would actually want to play, although it is, I guess, worth pointing now that I'm looking at the trailer that this is not the Snow Brothers I remember by any means. This is a completely different game, just starring some very old characters, snowman characters that blow up snowballs and push them towards enemies. Of course, if this could be done where you revitalize very old mascots, then why not Mega Man or Bomberman before the Snow Brothers? I mean, I guess it comes down to who has the license for what, but there is definitely more recognizable characters that you could try and revitalize before you get to Snow Brothers. Divine Dynamo Flame Freet launches November 22nd. This is a I guess spin-off of Card and Cell, because Card and Cell PC owners get it 1 week early. Or maybe this is just from the same developers, Card and Cell. Definitely looks like a old animation style. That doesn't inherently mean it's an old game. Yeah, but it also looks like an old game. Definitely doesn't seem like a card game. Yeah, this definitely has that feel of a Saturday morning cartoon style anime, where Card and Cell looks different and feels different. It's rated very positively, so I can go ahead and put that on the wish list too. This feels like a Mega Man Battle.net game, which it might be easier to play something like Card and Cell and not be built into the Mega Man universe. Savant Ascent Remix for Switch launches December 5th. It's currently available for PC. This again is something that was on the fall list that now, a year later, has gotten enough positive reviews to make it to the wish list. Of course, I'm definitely not getting as many, I'm not buying anywhere as many games as are being added to the wish list. And it seems like I dropped a few more frames. It's crazy. It's like 500 kilobits, roughly about that is what it's set to, and still seems to be dropping frames. Which, yeah, that's a really low stream rate. Anyways, moving on, VED launches November 14th. I have no idea what kind of game it is, but I do see that it is already, I did open a tab. Okay. Still not really sure what kind of game it is from the looks of it. Broken Sword, Shadow of the Templars Reforged for Switch launches November 7th. It's currently already available for PC. See, that's another one that didn't open up, so I'm gonna have to just figure out which links are working, which aren't on the Gamatsu point. The game is rated very positively. It's on the wish list. Any residual hatred toward AI generation to expand the edges of these images or clean up these images seems to have disappeared, which inherently you have two games that did the same thing with two very different outcomes. In the case of Broken Sword, Shadow of the Templars, they got away with using AI upscaling and image generation to just bump everything up to 4K resolution, with there being minimal controversies at the beginning, and then eventually when it came out, people rating it extremely highly. Although this also is potentially the third or fourth time that they've listed this game for sale on Steam, so it's difficult to justify paying $30 yet again for this game. And there's been versions of this game where the dialogue was changed a little bit, and I think the jokes landed a little worse on one of the remakes. And then you have the Killer 7 surprise update, which I guess that's inherently the difference, is that they came out quick and early saying they were using AI to upscale the images. Like all this on the edge here just wouldn't have actually existed in the original game. It would have just been closer to like this box here. And so Killer 7 never made any announcements of upscaling the graphics, so it would have made a lot of sense for them to make an announcement, say they were using AI upscaling, been held to some level of accountability because they're using AI upscaling, so then they would feel a need to make sure it was done right. Otherwise, they should have just realized that people weren't going to be into the AI upscaling of Killer 7, and they should have just put out the game with the same graphics or toggleable graphics and the other update features that they did. Inherently, you also have an example of I believe Revolution Software is a UK company, and the way they announced their game and did it, versus Killer 7 being a Japanese company and the way they did it, with perhaps a little bit more Japanese arrogance in that we will do it our way and you will like it, was applied to that update, and we won't bother to even announce we're going to do it. Whereas Revolution Software certainly tried to get people excited about the new release, and had Killer 7's update actually gotten people excited about the update, there would have been a lot less pushback, almost certainly. The Famitsu sales from the 21st to October 27th have been updated. Let's see, what do we have new? Switch for Romancing Saga 2, and PS5 version of Romancing Saga. Call of Duty Black Ops for PS5, taking the number 4 position instead of what probably would be the number 1 position in sales in the West. It only makes it to the number 4, and also highlights how little success Microsoft's acquisition of Call of Duty and Activision Blizzard has helped them in Japan, because we're not going to see an Xbox version of Call of Duty Black Ops in the top 20, at least. Probably not in the list at all. Of course, if people are playing Black Ops on the Xbox in Japan, they may be getting it digitally. Lots of new games here. Romancing the Three Kingdoms. Actually, very few Nintendo Switch games this week. We've seen a couple of weeks now in the past month where PS4 and 5 games are outselling Nintendo Switches in the top 10. And this seems fairly devastating as far as PS4 and 5 games. So maybe something like, well, you'd have to make the argument that like Romancing Saga for the PS5 or Call of Duty for the PS5 has caused people to buy PS5s this week and buy a second or third game on the PlayStation. Also, Call of Duty not on the Switch, Metaphor ReFantazio not on the Switch, Romancing Saga 2 potentially not on the Switch. And a lot of Nintendo Switch games, a lot of which are very old and were released a long time ago, are falling down the list here. Let's see if hardware reflects any of the software sales though. Switch OLED models still selling like hotcakes. Switch Lite selling very well, whereas the PlayStation 5, even combined with the digital edition, is only about half of what the Switch Lites are selling, and just pathetic amounts compared to the OLED models. And then that's not even adding in the original Switch. We are seeing a very high number here with the Xbox Series X digital edition at 536 units, but weirdly I don't know why it is in the 5th spot when 2,116 units were sold for the PlayStation 5 digital edition. Seems like those numbers should be swapped around, and if anything, the Xbox Series X digital edition should be in the 8th spot or 7th spot, and the Series S should be higher. Yeah. This order seems completely out of order. The only thing that would make sense is that they missed a digit. So let's assume that they missed a digit and this was supposed to be 5,360, which would put it in the 5th spot. And that would be a very high number. It would also imply, though, that either Famitsu or Gamatsu missed a digit here, because, which that also seems to be right, because it just doesn't make any sense at all. How can the Xbox Series X have 200,000 lifetime sales and the digital edition only have 3,000? There's at least one digit missing here, if not two. Probably two. Yeah, so just major typos, suspicious typos, frankly, that you would miss a digit here and here and still put it in the right spot. So, assuming that my speculation is correct, Call of Duty did seem to push the digital sales of the Xbox Series X higher, but not really push the sales of the Series S or Series X, which I'm willing to believe that these numbers are fairly accurate. Then only 557 Series S's sold in this week. Or, yeah. Let's see. Elderborn is coming to the PS5 and Xbox Series on November 8th. It's a first-person metal action fantasy slasher currently available on PC. This is one that's already on my wish list. That is yet another link that did not open. And then Croc Legend of the Goobies, or Goobos remaster launches in December, with the PS5 and Switch physical editions being announced. Alright. That brings us to gaming on Linux, which there potentially aren't that many stories that are new on gaming on Linux today. Horizon Zero Dawn Remaster may need a workaround on desktop Linux, which, yeah, doesn't seem like the PlayStation Network requiring versions of PlayStation first-party games are particularly quite as good. I would like to check here and see what the reviews are. Yeah, the remaster not doing particularly well here, 61% positive. What, let's see, is this 100% because of PlayStation Network as far as the negative reviews? Unplayable with controllers button work only intermittently, game cannot be closed properly, PSN requirement for offline game. Stick with the complete edition. Loading screen problems, PSN. So a big part of it is PSN, but there is also just some performance issues. So that they are saying just stick with the complete edition of the game. Certainly that's no way to run a remaster, is to have performance issues and also lock in a PlayStation Network version of the game that nobody wants on Steam. Black Mesa has a new beta that is, quote, way better, with way better support for Linux in the Steam Deck, which is nice. Black Mesa being the fan-made remake of Half-Life 1. Came out in 2000, so it's crazy that they're still working on it and improving it. Although I think when Black Mesa first launched, there may have been some content that is missing. I would assume that all the content is there now. Vampire Survivors Ode to Castlevania is out now, and it's a huge expansion. That definitely looks like a lot of characters. Really don't know what Vampire Survivors is, just looking at the screenshot. I would assume Vampire Survivors is still overwhelmingly positive. But then the Ode to Castlevania. Is that free DLC? Nope, it's extra DLC you have to purchase for about $4. I really shouldn't say about, I should know the exact price. I just looked at it. EA Respawn now block Apex Legends from running on Linux and Steam Deck, so they have decided to be lazy and save some money by making it no longer playable on Linux. There really is nothing more to it than that. They claim it's to combat cheating. I seriously doubt there was a significant amount of Steam Linuxes that were cheating on Apex Legends, but maybe there was. Maybe there was just this payload and pre-built image where you could run up a virtual machine, run up Linux, and play and cheat on Apex Legends for some reason. I don't believe that's the case, but it's possible. Steam Deck is the perfect platform for the game, says Escape from Castle Matsumoto developers. Yeah, this definitely looks like an older style game that would almost certainly work on Steam Deck. Kind of a weird looking game though for a modern release by far. You can claim a free copy of Return of Phantom from Good Old Games, Halloween Stale. I assume this game is actually playable on Linux. There would be really no reason why it wouldn't be. An epic roguelike called Caves of Quad. It now has a proper tutorial. It definitely is a case that too many games are getting promoted by gaming on Linux. But then they are also new games I haven't seen, so it's kind of hard to complain about new content, is it? You can check out the Halloween Horror Collection Humble Bundle with several games being playable on Steam or verified on Steam. It's funny that the Dark Pictures anthology games are so varied. I would think they would all be on the same engine and compatible or not compatible as a group. Mesa 24.2.6 graphic drivers have been released with a few more bug fixes. We won't get too much into the details there, but yeah, Linux graphics drivers getting improved is always a good thing. The Steam Deck SteamOS 3.6.20 beta has an updater fix and Metaphor ReFantazio performance improvements. Yeah. Fixed an issue with updater could repeatedly revert you to the previous OS version if certain configuration files were user modified. Fixed an issue where taking multiple screenshots and if game recording is on, and improved performance of Metaphor ReFantazio by up to 20%. It seems weird that it would just improve performance of one game, but it probably, whatever they did, improves performance of a lot of things. And this cutscene, I assume from Metaphor ReFantazio, catches my eyes. Yeah, I wonder if I really should investigate more about whether I should play Metaphor ReFantazio or not. Let's see. Steam games also now need to fully disclose kernel level anti-cheat on the store pages. So, they quote here, as we've heard from more and more developers recently that they're looking for the right way to share anti-cheat information about their games with players. At the same time, players have been requesting more transparency around anti-cheat services used in the games, as well as the existence of any additional software that will be installed within the game. So, there will be a new warning site that says uses kernel level anti-cheat, where if it's not kernel level, it's going to include anti-cheat software and Punkbuster. Let's see. It's telling me the specific types of anti-cheat software. So small improvements, but just nice to see small improvements in general. The Nintendo eShop in comparison, I imagine, hasn't changed one bit in years as far as what it discloses. Luma Island devs spent an enormous amount of effort to make it run smooth on the Steam Deck. Interesting. That is not really the kind of story though we want to hear. We want to hear stories that it is super easy and the devs don't even have to think about whether the game runs on the Steam Deck. It just runs. And we want to see eventually an end to the idea of game developers having to come out and say they have put extra effort or actually spend extra effort to make a game run perfectly on the Steam Deck. We just want it to work. And with Proton, there is a small possibility that that would happen, as much as games just work on computers. Coven is a fresh, hyper-violent retro first-person shooter in early access. Interesting. I assume you're either hunting witches or playing as a witch. Bazite has updated to Fedora 41 with expanded PC gaming handheld support. So, yep. Mostly Bazite, I think, is focusing around the Aya Neo, the ROG Ally, and a couple others as far as portable consoles, Steam Deck-like operating systems. While not actually being SteamOS. And it is Bazite and Chimera OS are the two Linuxes that are trying to look like Steam Deck and are trying to be somewhat close to the SteamOS that I know of. And the hope is that very quickly in the next year or so, SteamOS 4.0 comes out and then it just works on all AMD 64 x86 style computers, and you can just ignore Bazite and Chimera OS. There may just be no reason to even continue development on Bazite or Chimera OS. It would be nicer, certainly, if contributors could contribute more to SteamOS instead of it being really a closed process, which it really is more of a closed process. Like, I would say SteamOS is a closed source project based on open source projects like Arch Linux and the desktop version of KDE. But yeah, it would be nice if it was more of an open process and all the contributors and developers for Bazite and Chimera OS could just add anything that they can add to SteamOS version 4.0. Yeah. Certainly that would be weird if SteamOS version 4.0 started to gain major popularity and it was open source. It would be the equivalent of if Ubuntu started to be on half of all pre-built computers, which that never really succeeded because there was just too much Microsoft influence to promote Windows and too many pieces of software of the past that really needed Windows. Ubuntu with Wine never really tried to have 100% compatibility with all Windows software, and I still don't think you'd actually get that even today, whereas Valve is attempting the near impossible by having as close to 100% compatibility with every game on Windows with Proton. Fedora 41 is also out with plenty of enhancer like easier NVIDIA driver installs. I don't think there would be a real reason why you would install Fedora Linux otherwise, though, if you're not installing Bazite. Fedora 41 comes with KDE Plasma 6.2 that has improved Wayland color management, and Wayland versus X11 is the big improvement that the next SteamOS has to get over, is because they're still using a lot of X11 function calls, which is the old desktop compositor, versus Wayland, which is the newer desktop compositor. And that's going to inherently affect how your desktop looks and potentially affect just how much games themselves look using Proton. Let's see, Steam Beta adds plenty of game recording improvements, plus a Steam Play update. Yeah, it's easy to forget about Steam Play. There is just this ability to stream your games to a Steam Deck, or potentially even stream your games from a Steam Deck to a, say, Chromecast that you've sideloaded Steam Play onto. I don't think Steam Play is particularly built into too many non-Android TV type devices, where you could have kind of like a wireless docked mode and cast your videos to a bigger monitor. B-Link has open sourced their multifunctional X-Dock station for mini PCs, which I suppose is a way in which you would put a very beefy video card into a smaller PC. The big question is, how does it connect? Is it connecting through a PCI Express version 4 connector, or is it connecting via Thunderbolt 4 or 5? Not seen this one, so let's go to the store page and see if we can figure out what the connection is. Okay, so here you have your standard video card, X full-length PCI Express, that could be version 3 or 4, and then weirdly that seems to just connect with some connection card. So let's see, PCI X 8-speed allows for lossless connective to external desktop graphics. X8 is at least half as fast as I'd want. PCI 4.0 expansion for Wi-Fi or an SSD to 4.0.1 times 1. So there's another connector somewhere here for a different connection. An external antenna port. Yeah, there's SSD connections on the bottom, or Wi-Fi connections. So that would mean it would be keyed to do both A and B, but not at the same time. So the thing here though is, this doesn't feel like this just works with any mini PC at all. It seems like it would only work with their specific PC, because yeah, this is sliding into a slot on this mini PC, and it's sliding in a backwards fashion from the way you would plug in a video card into any kind of ATX, micro ATX, mini ATX standard. I don't think that there's too much more that you can really take from that. And it's a fairly expensive dock at that, at $160 for what is really just connecting things. So as much as I might be pro open source, I doubt we're going to see a lot of people embracing this dock. If you have a computer that can take in a PCI Express input, which the Steam Deck can't, not easily, then you could jerry rig something like this pretty similarly for probably a little less money. Yeah, I just don't think this is the future of cheap people or uninformed people are going to buy a mini PC and then realize they need to buy a $800 graphics card to put into their mini PC. I think at that point, if you realize you need an $800 graphics card and you're going to spend that money, you're just going to buy a $2,000 or $3,000 gaming rig to put it in. Let's see, Stellaris Grand Archive and a free update are now available. Two things there, I guess, are now available. This is one of those space fly around games, strategy games that aren't really my cup of tea, so I'm not going to put it on the fall list, but I will make a YouTube short around it so other people are informed. Speedo Llama is an ultra-fast, violent, and silly platformer shooter that is out now. And again, I just question as to how do I keep missing games that Gaming on Linux is not missing. You can create completely ridiculous weapons in the Survivor Mup roguelike shooter called Nimrod's Guncrafter Survivor. This is old news, which probably means the last 3 articles are also old news. Yep. This is old news. Full motion video adventure bundles on Fanatical have some great stuff for cheap. A lot of these also are compatible with Steam Deck. Alright, and that's gonna bring us to GameDeveloper.com, and yeah, we've streamed longer today. I guess I rambled. My macro's still not doing a good, not opening any of the GameDeveloper.com stories at all, so there's still improvement that needs to happen there, more tweaks. Nightingale Dev Inflection Games lays off staff as the UK office shuts down. Inflection UK's staff previously indicated the studio's office was being closed, and the CEO Aaron Flynn said that the Canada team will also undergo restructuring. This is that game Nightingale. Not sure it's released. Prior to Nightingale's launch, Inflection was acquired by Tencent in 2022. Let's see. So I guess it did get released at some point, but it doesn't feel like a lot of people were playing it, obviously. And maybe that is yet another indictment on like Tencent in that they are acquiring parts of companies, or but not really helping the industry grow in any way. I did see a video where in the United States, if you own 5% of a stock in a company, you are probably the major shareholder in that company, and there is a little bit more attention put into people who own 5% of the stock of a company, and so there are investment firms that manage people's retirement, so they're taking relatively middle class people in a lot of cases money, and then they are investing it into big corporations like Apple in such large numbers that then they have influence over Apple, and then they inherently are, at least it seems, putting influence on the CEOs of companies like Apple to always act in the best interest of the shareholders, which would be the investment company's best interest. And while that may get money back into the pockets of retirement funds and people's 401ks, for the middle class, it does it often at a disproportionate amount as it puts money into the hands of billionaires in the United States. And it also encourages CEOs to cut the salary of employees, so anybody below middle class, people without any retirements or pensions, are getting screwed in the process. And so it is this kind of pyramid scheme like redistribution of wealth by a redistribution of who's making the shots and calling the shots. And in general, I've gone on rants before and I won't do it again, where I think potentially companies should just be unable to be public companies at all, and that would solve a lot of problems. If companies could only be big enough as a big mom and pop type corporation, and then they become too large to manage because nobody can invest any more money by selling shares of that company or share buybacks to have something to do with the money, any extra money that I might have. That then makes the CEOs of corporations just think on a smaller scale. Think about giving raises to their employees because they can't do anything else. They would just be taxed the money if they didn't spend it back on either improving the business by paying employees more or improving the business by some other way. And I imagine they would find all kinds of ridiculous ways, like they already do, like buying jets for the CEOs and such. But yeah, once you let cash just flow out to shareholders, it becomes a much different priority in most corporations. Anyways, moving on. Ubisoft has recovered from a weak half year to let me start over again here. Ubisoft is planning on recovering from a weak half year by addressing polarized comments about the company. Despite missing the first half projections of this year, CEO Yves Guillemot said that the solid performance of the back catalog game reaffirms the quality of Ubisoft's brands, which inherently reaffirms the quality of old Ubisoft brands, not new Ubisoft games. But yeah, leave it at that. The developer Probably Monsters has laid off Battle Barge staff after the project has been cancelled. According to one artist impacted by these new layoffs, this marks the third unrevealed project Probably Monsters has cancelled. I feel like Probably Monsters might have been the developer of those RPG games, Sometimes Always Monsters and Always Sometimes Monsters. Weird, dumb name for a sequel. Confusing even me, someone who played the game, as far as which one is the first game. And yeah, I did not find that game particularly fun because it really was just this RPG Maker style game where you're going through a miserable time of being financially destitute. Meta ponders whether Reality Labs could be more efficient after it loses another $4.4 billion. The division has lost $12.7 billion during its current fiscal year, which I don't think you have to ponder at that point. Yeah, it definitely could be more efficient just by shutting down. Is that story we talked about before. CWA claims Sony is looking to further its monopoly position with the latest studio closures. The labor union has employed game industry workers to seek the security of collective bargaining. clearly there is motivation by the CWA to encourage more associate level employees in the video game world to form unions and work with the CWA to be locals of the CWA as far as unions. At a certain point, I guess if unions have a major saturation of a industry, they would stop promoting unionization, but that rarely happens. And yeah, I do think that video game developers, associate level developers, should be unionized, but it is going to be a unique situation in that you have one class of video game workers that are the QA workers that are barely getting paid and often aren't getting paid, and then you have a developer who might have a associate level or master's degree or even PhD worth of education as a video game programmer, and who might be getting paid very handsomely and just not seeing the advantage of worker protections for not being laid off or not being overworked. Scheduling is much more of an issue for your average video game programmer than their concern about being laid off. Particularly in the game industry, if there are going to be so many layoffs all the time, then unions need to form job pools, and the whole industry needs to be forced into a whole new way of thinking. Let's see. Same story as we already covered. Devs on Steam now need to disclose kernel mode anti-cheat software. I don't know what the penalty would be if you don't. I imagine Valve would just yell at you, and then if you didn't respond, they might take your game off of sale, but I don't think they're going to drastically do a sweep of a whole bunch of games that aren't disclosing kernel level anti-cheats. And Nintendo being Nintendo, being a Japanese company and not wanting to credit anybody, doesn't credit composers on the new Nintendo Music app. If you want to know who composed the Nintendo track, you have to seek out an answer somewhere else. Yeah. Surprise, surprise, a company that uses copyright and to its own advantage as much as possible does not want to credit music composers and imply that the music composers have any copyright to the music they've created. Although I guess at this point this is just continuing a long tradition of musicians being screwed by every single industry everywhere. Music probably is the first real example of where capitalism just doesn't work with art. And had it always been a situation where music couldn't be copyrighted and music could just always be played for free over the airs, over radio, and the artist got nothing from it, then at least that would be a more honest outcome, instead of music production companies implying that you could be very rich and only a few people actually making any money at all by creating music, and most people who did make money making music still struggling to continue to make money and a living by having almost non-stop touring and selling merchandise. Moving on, Alan Wake 2 has recouped most of its development and marketing expenses. Remedy is now preparing to enter the world of self-publishing. Interesting. It's always nice to hear a successful outcome like that. It seems to occur extremely rarely. And then the UK union IWGB Game Workers has launched a manifesto after topping 1,500 members. We envision a future where job insecurity, long unpaid hours, an inadequate compensation or a thing of the past, is a quote here. Inherently, anything that's labeled as a manifesto is going to be too long for me to bother to read, though it might be an interesting read, and I imagine it's not going to be too extreme. But there is perhaps a little bit of yellow journalism being used here, oddly by GameDeveloper.com, who is extremely pro-union in almost all of their stories. But it does seem like a little bit of yellow journalism to use the phrase manifesto, because manifesto is, in the minds of at least people in the United States, directly connected to the Communist Manifesto and communism. These unions are very much not communist. They are as capitalist as anything else. They are seeking out money for their members. They take money in the form of dues from their members. And that brings us to all the new games on Steam, which I imagine we're going to have a few. I don't think I'm going to be lucky and just burn through a ton of games today, although it's possible. There is a small possibility that maybe everything is just going to be absolute garbage. This looks like a text. So I did find out why we've seen a couple of games with the hentai tag still pop up, even though I was curating out adult games. And it's simply because I didn't have that word as a tag as one of the rejection possibilities. I just overlooked it, which stupidly I blamed my macro and said there was something wrong with my macro 3 or 4 times, just assuming that was the case, when no, the macro, the programming was working perfectly fine. I just didn't put the right test condition in. So now I've adjusted that. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe I even naively was trying to find out if there were that many games with just the hentai tag. And there really weren't, but even one is one too many, considering how tight laced, I guess, YouTube is. So yeah. Now, this one, on the other hand, there's no reason why this should be here, because this has the sexual content and mature tags. And so sexual content alone should have had that one closed. So there very possibly, I guess, is 2 problems. So I'll have to try and figure out what went there. We'll give this one a chance. Yeah. So I have been following Game Grumps playing their grocery store simulator run, but now that we're in the Halloween month, they also did a bunch of side horror game stuff. It's kind of hard to expect that they'll go much further with this long play that they're doing with their grocery store simulator. It's the game they've stuck with the most in a long time. Here we have the same concept, but a tobacco store. I don't know why having a specialized store is much different in that case from a grocery store. Tobacco stores in particular have kind of a weird chance of success, I would say. I know that Bar Rescue did a half bar, half tobacco store once, and it definitely felt like the host was kind of out of his element as far as promoting cigars and tobaccos, and usually they're called cigar stores. So this is some kind of weird clicker game where you're shaking and strangling a rat. At least that's a little creative. Still not something I would promote or want to play. Animal cruelty and all being a factor. Yeah. The trading card store simulator game is the only one that really feels like it's enough of a difference. And then there are other simulators that are just completely different. Like PC Building Simulator is nothing close to the grocery store simulator. Because, yeah, it would also be boring if you were simulating working in a PC shop just selling computers left and right. Of course, it still does get into the idea with the PC store simulator that you're just simulating what very likely is going to be a real world job for many people. And you're not really getting any training, and you really shouldn't be making entertainment from work. You don't want to get into some weird brainwashing where a generation of kids thinks that working at a grocery store is fun. Although it would be nice if you could find fun in your career on one hand. See, here's another one that doesn't have any of the text, so this one wouldn't ever get closed, even though there is some lewd imagery in here. I could close clickers, but even that wouldn't have worked in that case. That didn't have clicker. You're getting more of these kind of probably stolen or possibly licensed anime girl games that it's just a card game with anime girl backgrounds. Haven't seen a lot of those lately. But yeah, inherently, as silly as it may sound, you need to be dissatisfied about doing a job enough that you demand fair payment for doing a job, unless we get into a situation of no longer being in a capitalist society. I suppose if it is a socialist or communist society, then you may not be getting compensated for doing a job in the same way, and so maybe enjoying doing the job at that point makes sense. Of course, whatever real hybrid societies, economic systems come out nowadays won't be pure capitalism or pure communism or pure socialism. Not if they want to actually succeed. No one of those concepts makes sense in the real world. They have to be applied to more local issues and practical conceits. Probably being fairly generous today. I also went through the list of the top rated Android games and saw very few games that I hadn't already looked at. It's still very much a bad situation as far as trying to find mobile games. Most of them full of microtransactions, even if they are good games, to the point where they stop being good games if you want to be a free-to-play player. And yeah, I want to finish this, going through these games fairly quickly, because I'm going to have to run to the bathroom. And we are going a full 3 hours today. Which this seems like this is the first time ever since I stopped playing Yu-Gi-Oh! That we've gone this long. Yeah. I don't feel like I really rambled that much. But I must have gotten onto one speech and then another speech. I know I always call it rambling, but it's usually just a diatribe. Yeah. Yeah, I must have just had a little bit more to say these days. I guess we didn't actually make it all the way to 3 hours, 2 hours and 45 minutes. And as far as drop frames, 0.7% dropped. The bitrate is low. I'm going to come back and look at the video and see how that feels to me, but it seems like by unplugging my internet Wi-Fi router, my ISP's router, and my Wi-Fi router, step 1 the ISP, then let that reboot, then reboot my Wi-Fi router. That did seem to potentially fix some of this, but it still seems like there's some major problems there. Anyways, that's going to be it for the stream. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and keep on watching. Thanks.